Good morning. It's Monday again. This time I'm I think it's an interesting story that I had about one that we dealt with when we were doing a clutch job. And just about everybody, that some folks are concerned that manual transmissions will go away. My son just bought a 2020 Corolla that has a manual transmission on it because that's what he wanted. And I taught my boys to drive a stick on an old buggy I built them. Matter of fact, you can look on my YouTube channel. You can look up my buggy and theirs, because I built myself a buggy when I was about 14, built them another one 23 years later, and taught them how to shift, and taught my daughter how to shift too, driving a Volkswagen Rabbit. And it's kind of a tricky thing to teach somebody how to drive a stick if they had never driven a stick before. Especially if they're just used to putting it in drive and mashing the gas and going, there's a little bit more you got to know. It's not that hard to learn. I had a 94 Ford Escort when I was teaching over to college. It was a raggedy old 94 Ford Escort station wagon. And the guy at the parts store, he had his guy delivering parts on it. He decided he'd get rid of that thing. And so I bought it for $400. I used supply money, that I had for the department. And that was a raggedy little bomb of a car, but the students just loved driving that thing around the campus and down by the pond and all that kind of thing. And occasionally it would break down. They didn't go tow it back. But the point is, it had a stick in it, and they learned how to drive a stick. And I was looking for some pictures I had taken of that clutch. How it had just exploded and come apart and deposited all of its asbestos in the bottom of the bell housing. But I couldn't find that picture. You get so many pictures you've taken. Like I have I'll go through my Google Photos. I go on and on and on and on looking at Google Photos. I don't ever seem to get to the end of them. I don't know how many I got. Thousands of them, I guess. And most of them are, stuff like this car part. Anyway, the clutch, the newer ones, the manual transmissions that shift automatically have got 2 input shafts and 2 clutches, and I'm not going to cover that here, but this particular one, I start out talking about these Chevrolet pickup trucks. When I used to work at Sabine down in southeast Texas, just at the mouth of the Sabine River on the Texas side, there's a little town called Sabine Pass. And I worked for a company down there called Sabine Offshore Services. And in those days, all of the company pickups that the people on the dock used and all this, there's several pickups out there, and they were just little straight 6 pickups, and they had a column shift 3-speed on them. Some of them had Saginaw transmission. One of them had a Muncie transmission in it, which was a big surprise. First time I pulled that one out. But we were buying those little Arrow remanufactured clutches from the Delco parts supplier, putting in there, and we were literally, I had a big drive-on rack the welders had built out there, and I would pull it truck up on it. Was an outside deal. I'd pull the truck up on it, and I had gotten to where I had changed the clutches on those Chevrolet pickups so many times that I could drag an air hose and an impact wrench out there, and I could literally change the clutch in 30 minutes. I'm not kidding. I mean, you get to where you do it over and over and over and over again. It gets to where it's just old hat. And you didn't need any kind of transmission jack with a little Saginaw transmission. You just grab hold of it and snatch it out of there. And then your bell housing, you'd pull it off separately, And some, when I was talking to my dad about that, I had learned how to do that when I was working some with him. And, I said, well, if I don't have a lineup tool, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And he said, well, you can use your transmission for a lineup tool. You can show yourself holding up them. If you got an input shaft for out of a transmission, you use one of those, but it's got to be the right one. And then there's some universal ones, which I got pictures of a little farther along. Anyway, every 30 days, like I say, they were burning out of clutch. Finally, and it was like $29, $30 for a clutch kit for those vehicles, for the rebuilt ones. And finally I said, I'm really kind of tired of this. And I said, I think I'm going to buy one from the Chevrolet place. It was $160 for a clutch kit from the Chevrolet place. But I put one of those in there. The pedal felt better. The things never wore out. When I replaced all of those rebuilt clutches with clutches from the Chevrolet OEM clutches, new ones from the dealer, they lasted a very long time, and that ended the problem I was having with those clutches. Now, there was another situation. Since I was the maintenance foreman, we would have to deal with stuff. Sometimes you just got to deal with problems when you're in fleet maintenance. even if you don't have the equipment to do it, you got to deal with it. And there was a one of those trucks, the one that was that color of that one you see right there. We were putting in a new dock, and he had bogged that thing all the way down in the mud until there wasn't nothing sticking out of the mud but the trailer ball. I mean, that is how bad he bogged that thing down. It was just, and there was just, no driving it out of there, obviously. And the truck that I was driving at the time, now it had a 350 in it. It had that one particular one was a green one, and it had a 350 with a column shift, 3-speed, 3 on the tree. And I drove down there. I just threw a chain in the back because somebody brought word that this guy named Terrell was down there stuck and couldn't get out. And I just went down there by myself. And I usually try to get these jobs done as quick as I can, And so there was an old dock where they used to be shrimp boats out there and all. But all that had been cleared out, but there was still a lot of junk laying out there where they used to moor the shrimp boats. And I had a chain that was about 15 feet long, and I was thinking, with this Chevrolet truck, this 75 Chevrolet truck is what I was driving, with road tires on it and no mud grips, there ain't no way on earth I'm going to get this guy out of this bog with this thing. And, you don't call a wrecker, when you're way off down there. That's stupid. I mean, my job is to get the thing out. And I don't have to go back up there and get a pipe loader or something to drag him out. So I went and looked over by the edge of the water, and there was this piece of 3/4 inch, high quality 3/4 inch nylon line, like they use. It's actually woven rope, like they used on those shrimp boats. And that thing, I went over and looked at it. It was about 150 feet long. This was a long piece of rope. I said, I got an idea how I'm going to do this. And so I put a bowling knot on the end that was going to go to his truck and hooked it on the trailer ball because the back of the truck was facing the road. And he was probably about, I don't know, 60 or about 150 or 100 feet off the road or something like that. He's pretty good a little ways down there, but I was up on firm ground, and I hooked the other end. I tied a bowling knot and put the other end around my trailer ball, and I backed up and got as much slack in that rope as I could without getting back in the mud my own self, because it was muddy over where he was. And I said, get in that truck and roll your windows up, and I says, and I'm going to jerk you out of there. I says, put it in reverse and start the wheel spinning backwards. And I says, whatever happens, just, have faith that you're coming out of here. And so I gunned that truck I was driving in first gear, and I hit the end of that rope. I must have been going 35 miles an hour when I hit the end of that rope, and I felt that rope stretch like a big rubber band. And there was a big sucking sound, and that truck he was driving popped out of that mud bog like a cork. And I kept that piece of rope in the back of my truck for a long time and used it to pull vehicles out of the bog with my own pickup after that. I thought that was pretty cool. It's kind of a free rope I found over in the mud, you don't repeat that very often. But that company also had this big Lodestar 1850 or whatever it was, and it was a gas burner. If I'm not mistaken, I think it had may have had a 340 in it or something. It was a V8 gas burner. And that truck was a very peculiar truck, like I had never seen before. I had worked on international trucks before, but this one here was a deuce and a half that had a long flatbed behind it. And that's not the exact. I thought it was a truck, but it looked just like the truck. And later on, I actually put a brand new cab on that truck. Believe it or not, we bought a new cab and a new tilt front to put on it, and I actually refurbished the doggone truck. We rebuilt the motor and all that stuff. But anyway, this one here was built, and it had the engine, obviously, duh. And then there was a transmission right here, and then there was an auxiliary transmission. So this one here was a 5-speed. This one was a 4-speed. So this one was pulling through that one. And so whenever you put this one in your higher gears, I mean, basically it had 20 forward speeds. But now you never shifted this one while you were going down the road. You only shifted that one. You selected your range in this one. It was another gear shifter that was back behind the main gear shifter. And some of you guys may have seen this if you've worked on these trucks before. This was like a 74 model. But anyway, you put that thing in your, some of these knot heads, if you put this one back here in first, and you had that one in first, when you had the engine tacked out, you weren't going by 5 miles an hour, but boy, did it ever have some power. Well, a lot of these guys, they kept wanting to keep this one in fourth gear and pull real heavy loads and haul heavy stuff with it. and they would tear up the dadgum clutch just really, really bad. Another thing that happened on this, when it wasn't in need of a clutch, was the flywheel ring gear started slipping on the flywheel. And I told my supervisor, I said, why don't we just get out of there and let me use a welding machine to just tack that thing in about half a dozen places around there. Oh, no, the flywheel will break there. And I said, well, even if it does, we've got to put a flywheel in it anyway, and this will keep the thing on the road. So we did that and never gave any more trouble. I mean, I've had to replace flywheel ring gears before. You know, you heat them up, you let them drop on there. It's kind of like putting a wagon tire on an old wagon wheel. Anyway, we'd have to pull this transmission out and that transmission out to get to the clutch. And they were tearing that clutch all to pieces too. Every time you turn around, I mean, just anybody and everybody could drive the truck because they use it for all kinds of stuff, and they just tear that thing all bad. Well, I got a brass button clutch. That made the problem worse because not only, I mean, they didn't burn that one out, but the next time that one died, when I pulled it in there, it had busted the pressure plate and the flywheel all to pieces. Beat all I'd ever seen. I've never seen anybody destroy something like that, but that's the kind of stuff I had to deal with down there when I was doing fleet maintenance. But there was this parts house story. We were putting a clutch in some Chevrolet car, and I'd be doggone if I can remember what it was. It wasn't a Camaro, but it was some other car vaguely similar to that. I kind of know, maybe a Firebird or something. And they wanted $400 at both of the parts houses in town for a Sachs clutch kit, which, you know, I think came with a throwout bearing and a clutch and a disc, you know, pressure plate and a clutch disc. And also it'd have a little pilot bushing in there. And I would thought that was kind of expensive. You know, I had at the time it'd been a while since I bought a clutch, but I thought that was a little bit high. So I went ahead and called the dealer just to see. You'd be surprised how many times you can call the dealer and get a better price than what the parts house has got. In this case, it turned out that I got one from the dealer for $150. It was a Sachs. It was the same brand and everything. I was talking to the representative, the regional rep from one of these parts houses sometime later, and I says, why is it that you guys are wanting $400 for a clutch kit that I can buy from the Chevrolet place for $150? And that knothead just says, well, we just charge whatever the market will bear, you know, but you know good and doggone well they could have done better than $400 and still made really good money off that, you know. But anyway, what happened was, we went ahead and popped that clutch in there and everything was fine. Now here's a fun deal. This was a vehicle that belonged to one of my students, and his name was Steve, and the transmission had been swapped out in this Explorer. It was a 97 model, a little two-door, and it had been swapped out at some point. The whole transmission had been traded out, but the clutch was slipping. You know, you go to first, you go to second, and you're getting, you know, you're picking up speed on your engine, and it ought to be kind of accelerating pretty much at the same rate. You can tell when the clutch is slipping if you know anything at all, just like you can tell if an automatic transmission is slipping the same way, or if the torque converter clutch is slipping. Crowd the throttle a little bit when the torque converter first comes in. If you're picking up RPM but your speed's remaining the same, you know your torque converter is slipping if it's, you know, at 100% lockup. But anyway, he didn't have a lot of money, and we called and he says, well, I can't really afford a whole clutch. And so he said, I would like to just replace the part that's wore out. I'd like to just replace the disc. And I said, well, you know, typically the dealer will sell that because, you know, they're set up for warranty repairs and all that. And you know how the dealer is. Back whenever the cars had spark plug wires on them or something, you could buy just one wire. You didn't have to buy a whole set. And I don't know how many times I changed out just one wire at a Ford place when I was working over there. But most parts houses didn't stock single spark plug wires because they wanted to sell you a whole set. And it was usually cheaper anyway. Anyway, so we bought a disc, a clutch disc for this thing, and we bought us a throwout bearing. Well, a slave cylinder came with a throwout bearing on it because of the hydraulic. And then the fun started. We got that out of there. We got it all back in. We got it bled and everything. And we actually changed out the pilot bearing too. Now the pilot bearing, you know, that little pilot bearing right there, a lot of the times those needles will get gone. When those needles get gone, you've just got a hard metal shell in there, and that thing can be a pain in the rear to get out. Now they got all these tools and all here, they're just made for this, and it's like, oh, this is so cool. I can screw that in there and tighten it up and then slide hammer it off and all that. And I ran into that situation a few times, and having to chip that little shell out of there is a pain, particularly if you've actually tried to snatch it out of there, or, you know, you've done it and it's actually trying to, it's broke off the little forward surface of it. And so what I did was I came up with this method on my own. I found out a long years ago that if you've got a screw with threads on it, you can move the world just about, if you set it up right. This one right here is a workable solution for removing the bearing shell. When all those needles are going out of there, this works real good. You got to get a socket that's a little bigger than this so that this can go up inside of it. And you get this, I got a carriage bolt, long one, and then I got a 3/8 nut, All right, so I would modify the head of the carriage bolt by making it into a double D like you see right there. Just grind off here and here. And then I would use that little carriage bolt, that's an actual picture of one that I did, and get, with the needles all busted out of there, it would look like this. And so you hook that carriage bolt in there. You can only do that if you've ground the sides of it off. But you can center it up so it's pulling evenly on both sides. With your socket on there, you can tighten that nut with a washer, and I like to put some grease on the threads and some grease on the washer, and it will just pull that bearing shell out of there just as slick as a button. And that was something that I did a long time ago and figured out. And there's another little variation I did of that too. You can buy one of these tools right here to spread the manifold, like on your old 350s. Whenever you pull them off and you go to put them back on, they've distorted a little bit and the bolts won't go in anymore. Well, Lyle makes a tool like that. Doesn't cost very much. But what I came up with, I said I get a bolt and a socket, another bolt and a socket, and I just put it in there like that, and I could actually tighten that, hold it there. It doesn't have to be a carriage bolt. It can be a regular old bolt. But I'd hold that and tighten that up, and like I say, put grease on your threads and everything very gently. If you break the manifold, you're going to put one on there anyway. You can't put it back on there with them distorted with these too close together. And I actually posted this on a mechanics page that I was a member of on Facebook, and of course a lot of those guys say, "Oh, well, I just used the $20 tool." And I said, "Yeah, well, I spent the $20 on something else." I've always got a bolt and a socket and a nut and a washer. You know what I mean? I can come up with something like that, and I can make this thing work. If you can make it work with stuff like that, it's just a little bit of engineering you got to do. And furthermore, I didn't want to have to send to the parts house to get it. I didn't want to have to wait till the tool truck guy come. I had this right there and I had to deal with it in the moment. And so that was just the way that I handled that. There's a lot of different ways you can do things. And, a lot of people have the idea if you're making your own tools, you're basically have dropped the ball anyway. But I don't know how many times I've bent wrenches and manufactured tools and built little boxes with lights on them to do stuff that there wasn't any tool to do, But this clutch disc, after we replaced it, the clutch would not release. You could mash that clutch as far as and the pedal was tightened on top. We had it bled really good, which could be a pain on those. You might change out the clutch one time and you might bleed that slave cylinder real easy, where you get all the air out of it. It's no problem. The next time you may work on it an hour. And on some of these Chevrolets, you basically have got to take the doggone. They actually tell you to take the slave cylinder off with the line still connected to the master cylinder, with the line still connected to the slave cylinder, and hold it lower so the air will go up, to bleed it and all that. Sometimes it's just a real pain. Anyway, this one here wouldn't release. Okay, and so something was still turning the transmission input shaft. Whenever you disengage the clutch, that input shaft is splinted into that clutch disc, and it's supposed to stop turning so you can put it in gear. You absolutely could not get this vehicle in reverse unless you switch the engine off, put it in reverse, start it back up. That was unacceptable. We worked on that darn thing for a while. I said, look at here, we had put this other throwout bearing on there that we bought, or the slave cylinder rather, and this is the one that was in it when we originally pulled it out. Now, don't get confused by that. That's something else that's in the background. But this particular slave cylinder here was a little bit taller than that one. And I was saying, I wonder if that different amount of distance, because this is a different transmission and we don't know what vehicle it came out of, is the problem here. So we actually went to the trouble to put it back in with this longer slave cylinder, and I got that one bled out. That didn't change the daggum thing. All right, so remember, the transmission had been swapped out. All right, we took the flywheel off, bolted everything together, put it in a press, and it appeared to release whenever you put a press down there and you press that, pressed on it with a throwout bearing. You could actually move that clutch disc with your fingers course, that didn't really tell us much of anything, but we were kind of grasping at straws. You know how when you're working on something and it's a place where you can't see, you just have to logically figure out what's going on in that place where you can't get to, and that's what's going on here. So we were scratching our heads about that. And so we found the problem. This disc, when we put it on there with the transmission sitting there and a put a dial indicator on it, and we let it roll, we rolled it, you know, with a little wheel on the end of this, it had 85 thousandths of an inch of lateral run out. Now, you can get the lateral run out by getting rough when you're putting the transmission back in, or letting the transmission hang on the clutch. If you let the transmission hang on the clutch when it's not bolted all the way up, you can actually bend that thing to where it's out of line, and your disc is like this now, and it'll always be touching either the flywheel or the pressure plate, and that messes you up right there. And so what we did was we went and got another disc from the Ford place, and that took care of the problem. It never had any more trouble. Now, another problem is if you've got a rough end, pilot on your input shaft, and it doesn't travel smoothly with that bearing can keep it turning. And if you've got worn out splines, like if you've got the coarse splines on your input shaft, if those splines are worn out and the clutch can't move freely on there, then you can wind up having it one that won't release because it's, the little worn places in the spline are holding it against the pressure plate or the flywheel or whatever. And so that's something else. You're supposed to put, now the interesting thing about clutches too is the throwout bearing. Back in the day we had mechanical clutches, whenever I was, putting clutches in all those years ago, you didn't want to adjust the clutch linkage so that the throwout bearing was always against the release fingers on the clutch, on the pressure plate. We just weren't supposed to do that. Well, after they came out with these hydraulic, they call them concentric slave cylinders or whatever, and when they came out with those, that one rides against those fingers all the time. It never leaves those fingers and stops spinning, so it's always spinning. But anyway, that's what we found wrong on that. But what you have to do is understand the problem, think logically, and avoid the parts canon. Isolate the possible reasons for the concern and eliminate each one with good testing procedures. Perform the right tests. That's really important. And that can be challenging if what you're troubleshooting is hidden from view, but there's always an answer. And the ones that beat us up are the ones we always remember and we always learn from. All right. And this little release fitting right here, basically when you unhook it, it stops up that line right there. And what you do is you use the tool to disconnect the line. There's a little plastic thing here that pushes the fingers out of the way. The plastic thing is part of this. And when you use that to push it in and get it, and you unhook it, you're supposed to press the clutch pedal and see if the pedal is good and hard, because that takes the slave cylinder out of the system. And basically, if you've got air trapped in a slave cylinder, it's still got that square hole it used to have when that shift fork when that clutch release fork went through there on this particular one here. And what we decided to do, and what I've done on some other ones, is when we're bleeding it, I'll go in there with a big pry bar and get between the slave cylinder and the flywheel, and I'll pump the slave cylinder to work the air out of there sometimes. And sometimes that helps. But if you've ever been frustrated by a clutch that was hard to bleed, sometimes some people may have come up with a way that works really, really good every time. But about the time I felt like I had something like that figured out, I'd bleed 4 or 5 or 6 of them, it'd be no problem at all. And then you can find one to beat you up. Work on it half a day. The Dodge Stealth. This guy had this Dodge Stealth that he had done a pull the heads off. He bought it for nearly no money because it had valves that were bent because it had jump time and all that. And so after he put it back together and he got it running and everything, he noticed the clutch was trying to slip a little bit. Of course, as the clutch gets thin, the disc gets thinner, the pedal gets higher. And it gets to the point to where it's thin enough so that even at the top of your pedal travel, it's not quite clamped like it should be. And on that particular Dodge Stealth, we were able to make a little adjustment right here and get him a clutch that would hold. You didn't want to pull the transaxle out and put a clutch in there after he'd done all that work on the cylinder heads. And that worked really good for a long time. And so that's just a little quickie there. Now, do you need a clutch alignment tool? If you have one, it's not a bad idea to use it. They send one of these every time you buy a clutch. Every time you buy a clutch, they send one of those. But and you can start gathering those up and put them, but chances are you're liable to find yourself at some point, if you do a lot of clutch stuff, to where you're not replacing the clutch. You just have to pull everything apart and put it back together, unless you want to sell them a clutch while you're at it, which can be pretty pricey. If there's nothing wrong with it, or if maybe somebody else put it in, or the tool's been lost or whatever, they have universal sets. And you can use an input shaft from an old transmission too. That works really, really good. But you can eyeball it. Now there we are using the that's my hand there. There we are using the lineup tool. But you can eyeball that thing. And I have actually gone up there when we didn't have a clutch tool and snugged the pressure plate and get up in there with a bright light and just look straight into that hole, maybe with my flashlight. So I'm shining right in there, my little pocket flashlight. And I could move that clutch disc around so that it was just about perfectly centered, just using the eyeball method. And we'd put a transmission in. Now when you put the transmission up in there, you ought to have everything lined up to the point where when you put it up in there, your transmission jack helps. It'll tilt this way and that and turn. So whenever you put it up in there, it ought to just slide in there and go clunk, just like that. Sometimes people will be struggling to stab a transmission back in there, on a manual. And I would say, or it's automatic too. And they'd say, well, what do I need to do to get that? And you'd go look, and they'd have everything out of line, like you'd see the bell housing and the engine like this. And I say, now, if you were going to put two pieces together with your hands that you could hold in your hands, you would look at those and line those things up so that they would slide together. I mean, I like for it to slide all the way in there and, slide over the dowels. Talk about those again in a minute. And make it happen, putting it in like that. This was one of my female students putting the transaxle back in. Now for bell housing alignment, long bolts are okay, or you can actually cut some old bell housing bolts with the right side of the bolt and taper them a little bit on a grinder, and you can make you something like a Summit Racing markets these for nearly no money. And if you're going to be pulling your transmission out, putting it back in a lot, it's not a bad idea to have these. They actually have these oil, you might have seen these oil pan gaskets on some of these engines. It's got these little plastic things you screw in there with the oil pan, and they hold the gasket for you. And then when you slide, they actually will, when you slide the pan up, they'll click onto those things. Then you put all the bolts in, and you're good to go. And there's another clutch job. We did a lot of clutch jobs on that. For years on a rear-wheel drive vehicle, though, we would, when we do an engine swap, we'd unbolt the engine, disconnect the wires and pipes, swing it out. That's what we did the whole time I was growing up. And whenever I was doing in my early part of my career, I'd pull the motor out. I just unbolt it from the transmission and take the motor mounts loose, take all the lines loose, and I'd swing it out of there. Then you had to stab all that crap back in there. Well, I discovered later on, we started pulling the transmission first. Then we'd pull the engine. Then we put the engine back in, plug everything in. It's real easy, if there ain't no transmission to fight with, to set that thing right onto the motor mounts, get the bolts in, get everything else done that you need to do. And of course you need to leave your radiator shroud off of there so that when the engine's tilting around, you don't bust the radiator shroud or leave it unbolted or something. Anyway, you put the transmission back in, buckle it all back up. While you're at it, you can put a torque converter seal in there, and any other seals are easy to get to. And all that, and that just makes it a whole lot easier job. All right, that's about all I got for you today. This was kind of a short one, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I always like telling stories. And leave me some comments. Tell me something I'm telling you that's not right. There was one guy on one of my previous videos where I was talking about these people that that had said that they really couldn't afford to pay somebody $300 to replace the sensors in their transaxle. And I just, gave them the instructions on how to do it. And I think they bought a couple of sensors for $30 and popped them in there. And they were just, crowing about how hey, we saved all this money. And, this guy was giving me a hard time, talking like I was some kind of a dog because I gave somebody some advice so they didn't have to, try to go borrow $300 somewhere. There's about half the people in this country. I saw a survey results the other day somewhere, heard them talk about it on the radio. About half the people in this country, even before all this COVID stuff started, if they had to spend $400, they would either have to sell something or they'd have to borrow the money. It's always a good idea to manage your money well so that you don't have issues. And a lot of people are just down on their luck, you know what I mean? And I'm not going out trying to undercut shops or anything, but if somebody asks me a question and I can tell them how to do something and it's not going to be something that's going to be dangerous for them, then I'll typically just give them a few points. That little sensor in the rear end back there, for example, that you change on the old Fords, the old differential speed sensor. Those things cost about $12 from the parts house, and you can swap one out in 5 minutes. And it's not that difficult. Anybody that's going to handle a wrench can do it. So if I tell somebody something like that, and they didn't have to go pay a shop to do it. Shops have got overhead. I mean, I worked in shops for 25 years, and I mean, so I know about the overhead and all that, and how much a shop needs to make in order to stay open. The Ford place where I worked, the service department had to pay the rest of the dealership $25,000 a month just to exist, and so we had some overhead there in addition to everything else that had to be bought. Anyway, I sort of got off on a ramble there, but I will talk to you guys next time, and I'll look forward to your comments. See you later.